Welcome. We are continuing and today concluding our series on early modern philosophy by looking at Kant and Kant's what's sometimes called the Transcendental aesthetic. So what we're going to do today is just get a little taste of Kant's thinking as one possible solution to some of the problems that we've seen in this course. So here's the plan. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to review the nature and importance of synthetic a priori judgments for Kant. The nature of synthetic a priori judgments is super important to understanding how and why Kant offers a departure from the skeptical challenges that Hume raised. Then we're going to look at why our concept of space is a priori. And then I'm going to use that as a way into understanding Kant's main theory of metaphysics and epistemology, that's sometimes referred to as transcendental idealism. Now, our textbook for the course, edited by Shapiro and Lascano, does not actually go into Kant's transcendental idealism. So instead, we are going straight to the source, and we're looking at one of the classic advanced texts of Kant's, but we're just going to dip into it. So this is Kant's book, Critique of Pure Reason. This is the edition that's translated and edited by Geyer and Wood. All right, so let's dive in. Now, whereas Hume thought that there were two kinds of knowledge, matters of fact and relations of ideas, Hume thought that matters of fact are ways that the world is. You learn these things through experience. And then all the other stuff is a relation of ideas. Relations of ideas are basically conceptual truths. The number 2 is 2. Kant also has this category, like bachelors are unmarried. That's just a statement about the concept. It doesn't actually tell you anything about the world because it might have 1 billion bachelors in it or it might have 0. Right? But the way that Kant says that, we actually have a third category of knowledge is to get sharper on the distinction between a priori versus a posteriori, and analytic versus synthetic. Right? So the question of a priori versus a posteriority is the question of how you know it. Right? So this is an epistemological question about the sorts of evidence that you're going to use. A priori, knowable, independent of experience. A posteriori knowledge is dependent on experience. The other thing that Kant thinks about when he's thinking about kinds of knowledge, we might say, is he's also going to sort it into analytic versus synthetic. So when we're talking about an analytic statement versus a synthetic statement, we're asking basically, is it telling us something new? Right? And the way that Kant is going to ask about this is this a matter of conceptual containment or a matter of non-contradiction? So basically, the way that we want to think about it is, for Kant, he's going to ask, is the predicate of a sentence contained in the subject? So we might say, fat cats are cats. Right? Now, we might say that that is simply an analytic statement because it's something that's clearly built right in, our cats is built right into fat cats. Right? So those are analytic statements. We also have synthetic statements. Now, Hume thought that there were basically just the two kinds, like all bachelors are unmarried, conceptual truths. And then there are facts about the world that you learn through your senses, like it's sunny today, or the cat is on the mat. Right? But Kant's big insight is that there are some, in fact, synthetic a priori truths, right? So the thought is there are some things that you know independently of experience, but where what we learn isn't just a matter of conceptual containment. So Kant gives us the example, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now, what Kant is doing here is he's telling us, look, you know this a priori. Once you know this is true and you know why it has to be true, or you understand that it has to be true, you're going to realize that it's a priori. You don't have to check it again and again and again. When I say it's sunny today, well, I'm going to have to check that every day to see whether it's still true on each and every day that I make this claim. But once you think about short distances and straight lines, you'll realize that every time we're looking for the shortest distance between 2 points in Euclidean space, it's got to be a straight line. Right? So in this way, we're going to say it's known a priori, but Kant is also going to say that shortness of distance is one concept. Straightness, we might say that's a different concept, because that's a concept of shape. This is a concept of distance numerically. Well, those are different concepts. So we're going to actually say that we have a synthetic statement here. The statement, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, that is known synthetically because it's telling us something new, right? Another way that Kant sometimes distinguishes between the analytic and the synthetic is to say that analytic statements are explicative, that is, it explicates, whereas synthetic statements are ampliative, that is, they bring in more, right? It amplifies, right? Now, the other thing that Kant is going to eventually say is that 7 plus 5 equals 12. Well, that's arithmetic. We might actually say that 12ness is not built into the concept of 7 and 5 coming together, right? But we might also realize it's a priori. So it's telling us something new, but it's something that we know a priori. And this is how Kant thinks that we can do metaphysics, right? We can do metaphysics because some of the things that we can know independently of scientific experimentation and observation, well, we can know these things a priori. That is, we don't have to go out and check the world, but it's going to tell us something new. And that's the way in which metaphysics is not a completely useless field of study, according to Kant. Now that we've got this idea that there is this new category of knowledge that we call synthetic a priori knowledge, Kant is going to ask a big question. He's going to say, how is this knowledge possible? Well, Kant is going to say it actually has something to do with the structure of our minds and the structure of experience and the structure not only of what our experiences happen to be, but what our experiences have to be, right? And this is where we're going to venture into this really interesting idea of the transcendental aesthetic. So he's basically giving us a theory of how we experience certain things. He's going to say, what is the transcendental aesthetic of space? Right? Kant is going to say that we will learn very much by thinking about the necessary ways in which we have to think about space. And in the second half of the transcendental aesthetic, he's also going to talk about how we necessarily have to experience time. Right? Now, here's one maybe theory, is that we develop a theory of space via experience and inference, right? Like you start engaging with the spatio-temporal world, and you eventually come to this general idea of space in general. I think we can reasonably say that Locke would have endorsed a theory of that nature. But here's what Kant says. I call all representations pure in the transcendental sense, in which nothing is to be encountered that belongs to sensation. Right? So he's going to say, look, we're talking about pure representations when it is not something that you simply sense. And he says, accordingly, the pure form of sensible intuitions in general is to be encountered in the mind a priori, wherein all the manifold of appearances is intuited in certain relations. The pure form of sensibility itself is called intuition. So he's saying, look, you can experience things in space, right? Like I can experience a dog walking by, and I can see cars and trucks out my window, and leaves on the ground, and trees in the neighborhood, right? Well, these are things that we just learn about through sensation, right? But on the other hand, Kant is going to say beyond these particular bits of sensuous knowledge, as Kant would call it, he's going to say there's also intuitions in general where the manifold of appearances is intuited in certain relations. Right? So he's saying beyond my particular ways of experiencing space, I have a more general, or maybe like a precondition for experiencing things in space. This precondition for experiencing things in space is a general, pure intuition of space itself. Right? So he goes on by A23, B38. That is simply the marginal notation that we get in the edge of Kant's text. That's how we cite the Critique of Pure Reason, the A edition and the B edition. It says, for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, the representation of space must already be their ground. So as my being able to experience leaves and squirrels and trees out my window, those are certain sensations. I must already have the concept of space. The concept of space in general. And if I didn't have that concept of space in general, then I wouldn't be able to have more particular sensations and experiences and thoughts about what's filling up space. So here's the first point. Kant is going to say, no, we don't learn about the nature of space a posteriori. In fact, we learn about the nature of space a priori, right? So we're going to say it's a priori in the sense that prior to any experience, we have to have this pure form of sensibility of space in the first place. So here's what Kant thinks is really interesting about this pure form of intuition. He says that you cannot avoid this way of sensing and interpreting the world, and the conclusions that you'll draw from it are necessary. So Kant actually says, one can never represent that there is no space. He says, actually, in the structure of your mind, you cannot think of space being completely non-existent, right? He says, you can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. Right? He says, it's therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of experiences not as a determination dependent on them, and is an a priori representation that necessarily grounds outer experiences. So as a human being capable of having experiences, you cannot think about being in the world without thinking about the world as a spatial thing. This is actually kind of related to Descartes' idea, where Descartes told us that a material world, to think about that is necessarily to think about something extended, right? Something with shape and size and depth. Well, for Descartes, he was giving us a theory of what the material world is and would be. Kant is even suggesting that not only would a material world be spatial, but moreover, that we cannot think of the material world as anything but spatial, and we are so tied to this structure of thought that we couldn't believe in the absence of space altogether. We could think about empty space, right? So maybe we can think of the vacuum, or we can think of the empty space that existed before the Big Bang happened, perhaps. But we cannot think of space not existing. What would exist if it didn't exist? Well, nothing. Now, here's the other point. Not only can we not avoid thinking in terms of spatial representation, but he's also going to give us an argument that says, look, the way that we think about space isn't peculiar from me to you and the other person, right? He points out, like, if geometrical principles were a concept acquired a posteriori, which was drawn out of general outer experience, the first principles of mathematical determination would be nothing but perceptions. They would therefore have all the contingency of perception. So think about this classic example from Kant about synthetic a priori truth, which is that the shortest distance between 2 points, I've drawn a point here and a point there, and we'll realize that the straighter I draw this line, the shorter the distance will need to be for me to connect those 2 points. Right? So in this way, Kant is saying, like, look, when you learn this, you're not just learning something that you learned via experience, like that it's sunny today. He says maybe certain experiences might get you started, but your understanding is going beyond simple experiences. And in this way, Kant is going to say that when you have this realization about the shortest distance between these 2 points being a straight line, he says this is more than just a perception, right? It's not a contingent perception, like whether it's sunny today, but rather we start to realize this is something that you're gonna have to think, and you can't avoid thinking once you realize how space is supposed to work. Now, here's the next move. Kant is going to say, our representations of space as three-dimensional, unavoidable, and not particular to person to person. So for instance, we might ask the question, how do I know that the red that I'm seeing right now on the screen is the same as the red that you're seeing right now on the screen? And we might say, well, that's variable. It is true that perhaps when I see red, what's going on in my head is more like what green is like for you. All these sorts of secondary qualities that we learned about throughout this course. Some things are salty to me and not salty to you, or sweet to me and not sweet to you. Well, there we might say, yeah, the mind is bringing something to the picture here. But notice that mathematical proofs, and geometrical proofs in particular, don't behave like this. So we can't say that the structure of thought that helps us to realize that the shortest distance between 2 points, well, that can't be true for me and not true for you. So this is an important way in which these things are necessary. Not only do you have to think them for yourself, but they're things that don't vary from person to person, according to Kant. So he's going to say that the structure of thought that comes along with space, and he's eventually going to think about this in terms of time as well, these structures of thought are necessary. Whereas like perceiving a certain kind of fruit to be sweet or not is not an unavoidable or necessary way of perceiving the world. But Kant points out that once we start to realize that this is a structure of thinking that everybody has to buy into, he's going to derive some interesting points about metaphysics here. And this is where we get to Kant's famous, maybe to some infamous theory of transcendental idealism. So Kant says, our expositions accordingly teach the reality, i.e., the objective validity of space in regard to everything that can come before us as an object. So in this way, Kant is going to say, yeah, we can say that objects are real and it is an objective truth, right? That, for instance, all books, right? All books are spatio-temporal things, right? In that way, we could say that's an objective truth. This is something that we all have to experience when we start thinking about books and their relationship with space. But Kant also says, at the same time, even though these things are objectively real or objectively valid, at the same time, the ideality of space in regard to things as they are considered themselves through reason. So here Kant is saying, like, look, we can't think about the thing that is separate from our thought. Everything that we experience has to be processed through our pure intuition of space, right? So Kant is going to say we can assert the empirical reality of space. It is, we have evidence that space is a real thing with respect to all outer experience. Though to be sure, at the same time, it's transcendental reality. That is, that it is nothing, space is not anything, as soon as we leave out the condition of the possibility of all experience. This is a huge point for Kant, right? Kant's book is called The Critique of Pure Reason. Now, he's not saying that pure reason is a bad thing, right? In fact, what Kant seems to be trying to say is like it's an examination of this notion of pure reason. But we might also say a critique for Kant is an investigation into the condition of the possibility of something. Kant will eventually go on to write not just the critique of pure reason, but also the critique of practical reason, that is, an investigation of the condition of the possibility of how to reason about what to do. And he wrote the critique of judgment, the critique of making, and I believe it's aesthetic and function-based judgments. Now, but here Kant is saying, like, look, what is the condition for the possibility of experience, especially experiencing the world as a spatio-temporal thing? And here Kant is going to tell us, well, it's that we have to already have in us the a priori pure intuition of space, right? So space is not a thing in itself. It's not something that is real and exists as it is without the mind. Kant is going to say that space is in fact the creation of the mind. So this is why Kant calls it idealism. And we call it transcendental idealism. To say, look, it's idealism about the conditions for the possibility. That is, what grounds the possibility and reality of experiencing a spatial world. Right. So the idea for Kant is that for things to be and to be in space, well, that is as much a truth about our minds and how we experience the world as compared to the true nature of these things. When we talk about things in themselves, the term noumena is sometimes used by Kant to talk about the thing in itself. Well, can you experience the thing in itself, the thing that is wholly independent of our experience? And Kant is basically going to say no. Right? Only by bringing our a priori concepts of space, and eventually he'll argue our a priori concepts of time, will we be able to cognize the world. But that's as we might say, a processed or a filtered experience of the world. Things in themselves exist beyond space and time. Now, we already encountered idealism in Berkeley. Remember, Berkeley told us that to be is to be perceived. Kant was careful or insistent that his theory was not simply a repetition of Berkeley's idealism. So Kant thinks that he's not saying that there is no such thing or there is nothing beyond our minds. But what he is saying is that the things beyond our minds are essentially unthinkable until we experience them through our a priori concepts of space and time. So, just to recap where we've been. Kant claims that we cannot gain the pure intuition through experience of things in space. This is the way in which Kant thinks that space itself is an a priori condition for the possibility of experience. He's going to say it's unavoidable, and we all have to draw the same necessary conclusions about it. This is the way in which there is objective validity to geometrical proofs for Kant. Geometrical proofs, the more you think about it, are just ways of thinking about the way space has to work. And this is the way in which we have synthetic a priori knowledge, right? Only by having space as a pure form of intuition could geometry be synthetic a priori knowledge. And the last thing we'll say is, for Kant, space is not a ground for things in themselves, but instead, space is a precondition for our experience of spatial reality. Right? So the idea that space is something that we bring to experience rather than a thing in itself beyond the mind, well, that's the starting insight for Kant's transcendental idealism. This idea that the world beyond our mind, as we cognize it and process it, it might be something, but we can't really know what it is. Right? So this is Kant's transcendental idealism. Space and time are conditions for the possibility of experiencing space at all, rather than something that we learn through experience of the world as a passive observer. Now, here's a helpful way of thinking about this idea from Kant. Kant calls this introduction of transcendental idealism as a Copernican revolution. We'll remember that Copernicus, at the beginning of the course, we learned about Copernicus as one of the scientists who came to the realization that it's not the sun moving around the earth, but in fact it's the earth spinning and actually revolving around the sun. So what Copernicus does is he flips our perspective, right? And in the preface of the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant claims that he's doing something similar to what Copernicus did. So whereas Copernicus gives us a shift in perspective that helps us to change our understanding of things by saying, actually, it's the sun that stays put, not the earth, we get a shift in perspective that changes our complete understanding of the world, how it works, and its place in the universe. Well, Kant is going to say that by becoming transcendental idealists, we have a Copernican revolution, not in astronomy, but in thought. So the revolutionary idea, according to Kant, is the idea that it's not that we are passive observers of the world that gain a picture of the world through passive experience. That might be sort of a picture of what's going on in the lock, right? But for Kant, he's going to say, no, that's not how it works. We are not passive observers, but we are active observers who contribute something in the world. And as he's going to put it, once we become transcendental idealists, we will realize that objects conform to the mind. What things are have to be processed through our inescapable concepts of time and of space, right? So objects conform to the mind, not the Lockean theory, which says the mind conforms to the object. So at the beginning of the course, we learned about how we had scientific revolutions changing philosophy. Well, now Kant is saying, in a certain way, once we do certain philosophical work by understanding the nature and implications of synthetic a priori knowledge, well, it will actually deeply change our understanding of what the world is. That in many ways, it is the product of our necessary ways of experiencing it. So that's where we're going to wind up for today. So I've said a few words, 32 minutes worth of words about Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason here. You could spend a lifetime studying this book. Right? There are grad seminars dedicated to it. Many people become professors just learning how to better understand and explain what's going on in this work of monumental importance. But as this is a survey in the history of modern philosophy, what I've done here is given you a first taste of how to understand Kant's theory of space and time, and how it offers us perhaps an alternative between the realist theories of philosophers like Locke or Descartes and the idealist theories of philosophers like Berkeley, arguably Hume. So that's where we'll stop for now. Thank you very much for listening in.